All right, let's dive deep into Kenya in the 1950s,
Yeah.
a decade that really set the stage for the Kenya you see today. We're going way beyond those basic textbook summaries. We've got this amazing documentary packed with firsthand accounts. We're talking about hearing directly from the people who lived through this crazy time, a parent that was, full of all this stuff, the Mao uprising, the realities of colonial warfare, and just the incredible resilience of the Kenyan people.
You know, it's so interesting because the 1950s were like this huge boiling point, but that wasn't the start of the story. This documentary is really good at showing that the calm before all that, it was actually a forced peace. After years and years of the British Empire just kind of squashing Kenyan resistance.
That's where the human element of this documentary is just so powerful. We're not just talking about like dates and battles. We're talking about real people like Kabiro, whose stories featured. Imagine your family's land just taken away by white settlers. It really drives home the point that those European settlers, they were building their fancy modern economy on the backs of exploited African labor.
Yeah, and Kabiro's story, it's just one example, but it speaks to this broader anger and need for change that was bubbling under the surface. And that need, it really found a voice in these African political organizations that started popping up. So, think back to the 1920s, the Kikuyu Central Association, the KCA, and leaders like Harry Thuku. This guy, he dared to challenge the entire colonial system.
Yeah, Thuku was super important. But honestly, the story of Muthoni and Dingyu, that one really stuck with me. Talk about a bold move. She led a whole herd of cattle right to the governor's house as a protest. It shows how deeply frustrated people were with the whole colonial setup.
Oh, absolutely. And that frustration just kept growing. Then in the 1940s, we see the Kenya African Study Union, or KASU, forming. Now, they're supposed to just advise Africans on this thing called the Legislative Council, but it quickly turned into this platform for pushing African rights. And it was right there within KASU that we see the seeds of a more, let's say, hands-on resistance starting to grow.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. The documentary brings us to the emergence of the Kenyaland and Freedom Army, better known as the Mau Mau. They were a turning point, a shift from, peaceful protest to actual attacks on colonial structures. This wasn't just about land. It was a fight for their entire way of life.
And it's so important to remember this was a brutal conflict on both sides. Settlers armed up, formed their own militias, while the Mau Mau, knowing they couldn't fight a traditional war, they relied on guerrilla tactics. And that back and forth just escalated the whole thing.
I was struck by how organized the Mau Mau were. Oaths, secret codes, even this whole hierarchy within their ranks. They weren't just some random group of rebels. They had structure, a purpose.
Yeah, and the documentary makes it really clear how effective those tactics were, especially in the beginning. They disrupted colonial operations, instilled fear in the settler community. The government had to react.
And they reacted fast. In 1952, the colonial government declares a state of emergency. Curfews, mass arrests, detention camps. It was a full-on crackdown on the Kenyan people.
This is where things get dark. One of the key events that really fueled the conflict was this raid called Operation Jock Scott. This led to the arrest of Jomo Kenyatta, a major figure in the fight for Kenyan independence.
Can you even imagine what it was like living under those conditions? This documentary, it paints this vivid picture of life in Kenya during that state of emergency. Fortified villages, restrictions on movement, there's constant fear and surveillance, basically a whole country under siege.
And it wasn't just the physical restrictions. Traditional African culture was disrupted in a huge way. Forced labor, kazi, they called it, became the norm. People herded into these concentration villages. It completely flipped their lives upside down. And there's this detail in the documentary. The men, they were uncomfortable using communal toilets. It was just so different from their traditions.
It shows how deeply all that upheaval affected their everyday lives, forcing them into this cash economy, whether they were ready or not. People, once self-sufficient farmers, now they had to rely on shops, using money they often didn't even have.
It created this dependence on the very system they were fighting against. And on top of that, the colonial propaganda machine was working overtime in Kenya, internationally, trying to paint the Mau Mau as savage terrorists while downplaying their own brutality.
Classic misinformation, right? Controlling the narrative to justify their actions.
Oh, yeah.
This documentary does a great job contrasting that propaganda with what was actually happening, showing the Mau were fighting for their land, their freedom, their way of life.
Yeah, but it came at a heavy price. The human toll of this war was immense. We're not just talking about deaths and injuries. This was sexual violence, economic hardship, profound psychological trauma. Entire communities were affected.
You hear the stories of the children born out of wedlock during all that chaos and violence, and it just breaks your heart. Imagine carrying that weight, that reminder, for your entire life.
And it's that lasting trauma that led to the 1950s in Kenya being called the Lost Decade.
Lost decade. It's such a powerful phrase. Can you break that down a bit? What does it actually mean?
It goes way beyond just the physical stuff, like lives lost, property destroyed. It's about losing your innocence, losing trust, losing that sense of normalcy for an entire generation.
Yeah.
And the documentary makes it clear, there wasn't much, if any, psychological support for the people who lived through all that. Imagine just trying to cope with that. Those wounds, they didn't just heal overnight. They affected people, communities, long after the fighting stopped.
So it wasn't just individual trauma, but like societal trauma.
Exactly. The documentary highlights how those events, back in the 50s, they ripped apart the core of Kenyan society. Traditional values and customs just shaken, families torn apart, entire communities fractured. It created this feeling of collective trauma that resonated across generations.
It's hard to even imagine the resilience it must have taken to survive all that.
It really is. And this documentary does a great job of showing that resilience, that hope that persisted even in the darkest times. You hear about Kenyans who resisted, the songs they used to keep their spirits up, that unwavering determination to achieve independence.
It's incredible. Even with all that brutality, they never gave up hope.
No, and they didn't. The documentary mentions this term, Matari Magi, which means the remnants of the bullets. It refers to the spirit that remained, even after all the violence. They also use the term teraheti, or the stubborn kneecap bone, to represent that refusal to be broken by oppression.
Those terms are so powerful. They capture that indomitable spirit. It's like this testament to the human capacity for hope and resilience, even when you're facing impossible circumstances.
And that hope, it was eventually rewarded. In 1963, Kenya finally got its independence, a new chapter in their history.
Wow, what a moment that must have been. It's a reminder that even the most brutal regimes, they can't crush that human desire for freedom. But even with independence, those scars from the 1950s, they didn't just magically disappear, right?
Yeah, sadly, no. The legacy of that decade, those turbulent years, it continues to shape Kenya in so many ways. The documentary touches on the long-term effects of all that trauma, the economic disparities, the political challenges that followed independence.
It's kind of a sobering thought.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, what if there had been a real effort to address the psychological damage back then? How would things be different?
Yeah. It definitely raises questions about healing, about reconciliation, not just in the immediate aftermath of conflict, but as a continuous process.
This deep dive, it's shown just how important it is to understand this period in Kenyan history. It's not just some events in a textbook. It's a human experience with consequences that are still felt today. It's about understanding the effects of colonialism, the resilience of the Kenyan people, and that complex legacy that they're still grappling with.
Yeah, it's a history everyone should know. And this documentary, it's a really powerful way to enter into that world.
Man, what a journey. This deep dive has been just really eye-opening, going through this turbulent decade in Kenya's history. Thanks for sticking with us as we explore the 1950s, a time that, honestly, it's often kind of overshadowed by that big moment of independence. But as we've seen, it's a story worth telling. It's a story about struggle, about resilience, and the human spirit just shining through.
Yeah, it leaves you with a lot to chew on, that's for sure. How did all this back in the 50s shape the Kenya we know today? What are those lasting impacts of colonial rule, the Mao uprising, and how do we learn from all this, this complicated history, to build a better future?
Big questions, but definitely worth thinking about. If this deep dive has sparked something in you, go check out this documentary. It's powerful stuff, hearing these stories firsthand.
And don't stop there. There are some books mentioned in the documentary that they dig even deeper into this time period. Lots more to learn about Kenya in the 1950s.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this thought. The 1950s in Kenya, it was a time of just incredible pain and suffering. But it was also a time of immense courage, resilience, hope. It's history we need to remember, not just for the tragedies, but for the lessons it teaches us about the human spirit and our ability to make change happen.
It's a good reminder, even in those dark times, that flicker of hope, it never really goes out. And understanding the past, it's crucial if we want to create a better future.